Eleanor Grayson stood at the edge of her kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the worn handle of her favorite teacup. The house, once a sanctuary of warmth and laughter, now felt like a battlefield, its walls echoing with betrayal. At 68, Eleanor had lived through decades of love, loss, and quiet victories. But nothing prepared her for this. Her husband of 45 years, Harold, had brought his mistress, Clara, into their home. The audacity of it burned in her chest, a fire she hadn't felt since her youth. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, a scent Eleanor had always associated with order. But now it mocked her. Clara's perfume lingered in the air, cloying and invasive, a reminder that another woman had claimed space in Eleanor's world. Harold had announced it casually, as if it were a business decision, his voice devoid of shame. "Clara's moving in," he'd said, adjusting his glasses as though discussing the weather. "It's time we all adjust." Adjust. The word sliced through Eleanor's heart. But she didn't flinch. Not in front of him. Eleanor had always been the steady one, the one who balanced Harold's impulsiveness with her quiet strength. They'd built a life together, a modest house in the suburbs, 2 children now grown with families of their own, and a small real estate business that had weathered economic storms. Harold was the charmer, the one who closed deals with a wink and a smile, while Eleanor managed the books, her meticulous nature ensuring their survival through lean years. But now, at the twilight of their lives, Harold had chosen Clara, a woman 20 years younger, with a laugh that grated like cheap wine. Eleanor set the teacup down, her movements deliberate. She wouldn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the study, where the family's financial records were kept. The room was a shrine to their shared history, photos of their children, framed certificates, a faded map of the town they'd helped shape through their business. But it was also where Eleanor's power lay. Harold might have forgotten, but she hadn't. Every property, every loan, every contract bore her signature as much as his. She'd been the backbone, and now she'd be the reckoning. Clara's arrival had been a slow poison. It began with late-night phone calls Harold dismissed as work, then weekend trips he claimed were for networking. Eleanor wasn't naive. She'd seen the signs but hoped age would temper Harold's restlessness. When he finally admitted the affair, she'd expected remorse. Instead, he'd doubled down, inviting Clara into their home as if Eleanor's decades of devotion were disposable. Clara, with her manicured nails and designer bags, strutted through the house, redecorating Eleanor's carefully curated spaces with garish colors and modern art that clashed with the home's soul. Eleanor's first instinct was to leave, to pack a bag and retreat to her daughter's house across town. But something stopped her. This house wasn't just walls and mortar, it was her legacy. She'd poured her heart into every corner. From the garden she tended each spring to the kitchen table where she'd hosted countless family dinners. Leaving would mean surrendering, and Eleanor Grayson did not surrender. Instead, she began to watch. Clara and Harold thought her invisible, a relic to be ignored. But Eleanor was sharp. She noticed Clara's spending extravagant dinners, new furniture, a sleek car parked in the driveway. Harold, ever the fool for a pretty face, indulged her, dipping into their joint accounts without a second thought. But Eleanor knew the accounts better than anyone. She knew the limits, the loans, the fine print, and she knew how to wield them. One evening, as Clara lounged on the new leather sofa she'd insisted on buying, Eleanor sat across from her, a ledger in her lap. "This house is in both our names," Eleanor said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Clara barely looked up, scrolling through her phone. "Harold says it's fine," she replied, dismissive. Eleanor smiled thinly. Harold might have forgotten the details, but Eleanor hadn't. The house, their business, their entire financial web was all intertwined, and Eleanor held the threads. She began her plan that night. It wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was hers. Eleanor had spent her life building, and she wouldn't let it be dismantled by a man who'd lost his way and a woman who saw her as irrelevant. She contacted their lawyer, a quiet man who'd known Eleanor since their early days. "I need to review our assets," she said, her voice steady. He didn't ask questions. He knew her too well. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor worked in secret. She pored over contracts, traced every dollar, and uncovered Harold's reckless financial moves. He'd taken out a second mortgage on the house to fund Clara's whims, assuming Eleanor wouldn't notice. But she did. She always did. She found discrepancies in their business accounts. Loans Harold had co-signed with Clara for properties they couldn't afford. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Harold and Clara were building a dream on a foundation of sand, and Eleanor could make it crumble. She didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, she gathered evidence, her hands steady as she typed emails to their bank, their creditors, their partners. She was polite, professional, but relentless. Every move was calculated, every document a weapon. Eleanor wasn't just fighting for her home, she was fighting for her dignity, for the years she'd given to a man who thought he could erase her. By the time Clara noticed something was wrong, it was too late. The bank called about missed payments. Creditors sent letters, and their business partners began pulling out. Harold, flustered, tried to smooth things over, but Eleanor was always one step ahead. She'd frozen accounts, flagged transactions, and alerted authorities to irregularities in their finances. Clara's dream of a lavish life with Harold began to fray, and Eleanor watched, silent, as the cracks widened. One night, as the house grew quiet, Eleanor stood in the garden she'd tended for decades. The roses, her pride, bloomed fiercely despite the chaos inside. She thought of her children, her grandchildren, the life she'd built. This wasn't just about her, it was about legacy, about ensuring that those who came after her would inherit strength, not shame. She clutched a letter from the bank, confirming the foreclosure process she'd set in motion. Harold and Clara could have their dreams, but they'd build them somewhere else. The fire in her chest burned brighter now, not with anger, but with purpose. Eleanor Grayson was no longer the quiet wife, the invisible partner. She was a force, and she would not be undone. The days that followed were a delicate dance of restraint and strategy. Eleanor moved through the house with the grace of a woman who knew her worth, even as Harold and Clara carried on as if she were a ghost. Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, each note a jab at Eleanor's pride, but she refused to let it break her. Instead, she channeled her energy into her plan, her fingers flipping through files late into the night, her mind sharp despite the weight of betrayal. Harold, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued to parade Clara around town. They attended local events, Clara draped in jewelry Eleanor knew came from their joint savings. The townsfolk whispered, their pitying glances stinging more than Eleanor cared to admit. She'd always been a private woman, content to let Harold bask in the spotlight. But now those whispers fueled her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every woman who'd ever been dismissed. Every heart quietly broken by betrayal. Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, noticed the change first. During a rare visit, she found her mother in the study, surrounded by papers. "Mom, what's going on?" Margaret asked, her brow furrowed. Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't told her children about Clara, not wanting to burden them with her pain. But Margaret's eyes, so like her own, demanded truth. "Your father's made choices," Eleanor said simply, her voice steady. "And I'm making mine." Margaret pressed, but Eleanor deflected, promising to explain later. She couldn't risk her children interfering. Not yet. This was her battle, and she needed to fight it alone. But Margaret's concern lingered, a reminder of the family Eleanor was protecting. Her son, Thomas, lived across the country, busy with his own life. But she knew he'd be furious if he learned the truth. For now, she kept them at a distance, her focus unwavering. Eleanor's next move was to meet with their accountant, Mr. Daniels, a man who'd seen their business grow from a single rental property to a portfolio of modest homes. He was loyal to Eleanor, having always admired her precision. "Harold's been reckless," she told him, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were records of unauthorized withdrawals, risky loans, and properties leveraged beyond reason. Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow but nodded. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to protect what's mine," Eleanor replied. "And I want them to feel the consequences." She outlined her plan: quietly transfer assets to her name where possible, flag Harold's transactions for review, and push their over-leveraged properties toward foreclosure. It was a slow burn, designed not to destroy Harold, but to dismantle the fantasy he'd built with Clara. Mr. Daniels agreed to help, his loyalty rooted in years of watching Eleanor's quiet strength hold their world together. Clara, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. She redecorated the guest room, turning it into her personal haven, oblivious to the fact that the house itself was slipping out of her grasp. Eleanor watched her, noting every purchase, every extravagant gesture. Clara's confidence was her weakness. She assumed Harold's wealth was endless, that Eleanor was too broken to fight back. But Eleanor was far from broken. One afternoon, as Clara pranced through the living room in a new silk dress, Eleanor sat at the dining table, pretending to read. "That's a lovely dress," she said, her tone neutral. Clara smirked, twirling. Harold picked it out. Eleanor nodded, her eyes flicking to the stack of bills she'd left on the table, bills Harold hadn't paid, bills that would soon trigger notices. Clara didn't notice, but Eleanor did. She always did. The first cracks appeared when a creditor called during dinner. Harold's face paled as he excused himself, muttering about a mix-up. Clara, annoyed, complained about the interruption, but Eleanor ate in silence, her heart steady. She'd alerted the bank to the missed payments on their second mortgage, knowing it would set off a chain reaction. Harold's charm couldn't fix this knot when the numbers didn't lie. By the end of the month, the pressure was mounting. Harold's business partners, once loyal, began distancing themselves. A deal for a new property fell through when the bank flagged their credit. Clara, frustrated, blamed Harold, her voice sharp as she demanded answers. Eleanor listened from the hallway, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to raise her voice, her work was doing the talking. Eleanor's nights were spent in the study, her sanctuary. She pored over legal documents, her eyes straining under the dim light of a single lamp. Each page was a step toward reclaiming her life. She found a clause in their business agreement that allowed her to assume control if Harold's actions jeopardized the company. It was a clause she'd insisted on years ago, a precaution Harold had laughed off. He wasn't laughing now. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's plan took shape. She transferred key assets to a trust in her name, ensuring her children's inheritance was safe. She met with their lawyer again, finalizing documents that would protect her share of the business. And she waited, patient as ever, for the moment when Harold and Clara would realize the ground beneath them was gone. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Eleanor stood at the window, watching rain lash the garden. The roses bent under the weight, but didn't break. Like her, they endured. She thought of the years she'd spent loving Harold, the sacrifices she'd made. She didn't hate him, not really. But she wouldn't let him destroy what they'd built. Not for Clara. Not for anyone. The bank's foreclosure notice arrived the next day, slipped into the mailbox like a quiet promise. Eleanor retrieved it, her hand steady. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew what it said, and she knew what it meant. Harold and Clara's dreams were unraveling, and Eleanor was the one pulling the threads. The foreclosure notice sat unopened on Eleanor's desk, a silent testament to her resolve. She didn't need to read it to know its power. It was the culmination of weeks of careful planning, a weapon forged in silence. The house, once a symbol of her and Harold's shared dreams, was now a battleground, and Eleanor was winning. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt heavy, like the weight of 45 years pressing against her chest. Harold's behavior grew erratic as the financial noose tightened. He spent hours on the phone, his voice rising in frustration as deals collapsed and creditors closed in. Clara, sensing the shift, became more demanding, her voice sharp as she questioned Harold's competence. "You said this was handled," she snapped one evening, her words carrying through the thin walls to where Eleanor sat in the study. Eleanor didn't react, but her lips curved slightly. Clara's confidence was cracking, and Eleanor knew it was only the beginning. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder. Eleanor felt their eyes on her at the grocery store, their pity now mixed with curiosity. She held her head high, her silver hair catching the light as she moved through the aisles. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But at home, alone in the quiet of her bedroom, she allowed herself moments of vulnerability. She'd loved Harold fiercely once, believed in the life they'd built. Now, that love was a ghost, haunting her as she rebuilt her future. Eleanor's children began to suspect the truth. Margaret called more often, her questions pointed. "Dad's acting strange," she said during one call. "And who's that woman in the house?" Eleanor deflected again, but the weight of keeping secrets was growing. She wanted to protect her children, to shield them from the ugliness. But she knew the truth would surface soon. For now, she focused on her plan, knowing it was for them as much as for herself. She met with Mr. Daniels again, this time to discuss the business. "Harold's been signing contracts without my approval," she said, handing over a stack of documents. "That violates our agreement." Mr. Daniels nodded, his expression grim. "This could dissolve the partnership," he warned. Eleanor met his gaze. "Good," she said simply. She wasn't just protecting her assets, she was severing the ties that bound her to Harold's betrayal. Clara, meanwhile, grew bolder in her attempts to claim the house. She rearranged furniture, hung new curtains, and even suggested selling Eleanor's beloved garden to modernize the property. Each act was a provocation, but Eleanor remained calm, her silence a shield. She knew Clara's confidence was built on ignorance of the financial storm Eleanor had unleashed. The bank had already begun proceedings on the second mortgage, and their business was teetering on the edge of collapse. One morning, as Eleanor sipped her tea in the kitchen, Harold stormed in, his face red. "What have you done?" he demanded, waving a letter from the bank. Eleanor set her cup down, her movements deliberate. "I've done what I had to," she said, her voice steady. "You brought her here, Harold. You made your choice." He sputtered, but she held his gaze, unyielding. For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes, not of her, but of the consequences of his actions. Clara's reaction was less restrained. She confronted Eleanor that afternoon, her voice shrill. "You're trying to ruin us," she accused, her manicured nails digging into her palms. Eleanor stood, her posture regal despite the ache in her bones. "This is my home," she said softly, but with a force that silenced Clara. "You don't belong here." Clara stormed out, but Eleanor knew the words had landed. Clara wasn't fighting for love, she was fighting for security, and that was slipping away. Eleanor's plan moved forward relentlessly. She worked with the lawyer to finalize the trust, ensuring her children's inheritance was secure. She met with creditors, presenting evidence of Harold's mismanagement, and watched as their business partners withdrew support. Each step was a brick in the wall. She was building a wall to protect her legacy and dismantle Harold's illusions. One evening, as she sorted through old photos in the study, Eleanor found a picture from their early years, her and Harold, young and smiling, standing in front of their first rental property. The memory stung, but it also reminded her why she was fighting. That young woman, full of hope, deserved better than to be erased. Eleanor tucked the photo away, her resolve hardening. The foreclosure process gained momentum. Notices piled up, and Harold's attempts to fix things grew desperate. He tried to charm the bank, but Eleanor had already spoken to them, her calm authority outweighing his bluster. Clara, sensing the end, began packing her things, her bravado replaced by panic. Eleanor watched from the sidelines, her heart a mix of sorrow and strength. She didn't want to destroy them, she wanted them to learn. As the days passed, the house grew quieter. Clara's laughter was gone, replaced by tense arguments between her and Harold. Eleanor moved through the space with purpose, tending her garden, organizing her papers, reclaiming her home. She wasn't just fighting for bricks and mortar, she was fighting for her dignity, for the life she'd built, for the woman she'd always been. By the time the final foreclosure notice arrived, Eleanor was ready. She stood in the garden, the roses blooming fiercely despite the autumn chill. She held the notice in her hands, its weight a reminder of her power. Harold and Clara could have their dreams, but they'd have to build them elsewhere. Eleanor Grayson was no longer invisible, and she would not be undone. The house felt emptier now, though Clara's belongings still cluttered the guest room. Her presence lingered like a stain, but Eleanor sensed the tide turning. The foreclosure notice had shaken Harold and Clara, their arguments growing louder, their confidence crumbling. Eleanor moved through her days with quiet purpose, her plan unfolding like the petals of her roses, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Harold tried to confront her again, his voice a mix of anger and desperation. "You're destroying everything we built," he shouted one evening, his hands shaking as he waved another bank letter. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her hands folded, her gaze steady. "You destroyed it first," she said, her voice low but piercing. "You brought her into our home. Harold, you chose this." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. For the first time, Eleanor saw the weight of his choices settle in his eyes. Clara, meanwhile, was unraveling. Her designer bags were packed, but she had nowhere to go. She'd staked everything on Harold's promises, assuming his wealth was limitless. Now, with creditors circling and the business collapsing, her dream was slipping away. She avoided Eleanor, her earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen silence. Eleanor didn't gloat, she didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. Eleanor's children could no longer be kept in the dark. Margaret showed up unannounced one afternoon, her face tight with worry. "Mom, tell me the truth," she demanded, standing in the living room where Clara's gaudy decorations clashed with Eleanor's timeless taste. Eleanor sighed, knowing the time had come. She told Margaret everything: Harold's affair, Clara's invasion, the financial ruin they'd courted. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she hugged her mother fiercely. "You're stronger than I ever knew," she whispered. Eleanor smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Strength, she'd learned, often came at a cost. Thomas, her son, called that evening, his voice sharp with anger. "Why didn't you tell us?" he demanded. Eleanor explained her need to handle it alone, to protect them until she was ready. "This is my fight," she said, "but it's for you, too." Thomas promised to fly in, but Eleanor asked him to wait. She wasn't done yet. She needed to see this through. Her meetings with Mr. Daniels and the lawyer became more frequent. The business was now effectively under her control, thanks to the clause she'd invoked. Harold's reckless decisions had given her the legal grounds to take charge, and she did so with precision. She sold off non-essential properties, paid down critical debts, and ensured the core of their legacy, the house and key rentals, remained in her name. It was a delicate balance, saving what mattered while letting Harold and Clara's excesses collapse under their own weight. One morning, as Eleanor tended her garden, Clara approached her, her face pale. "You've won, haven't you?" she said, her voice brittle. Eleanor paused, her hands in the soil, and looked up. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about what's right." Clara stared, as if seeing Eleanor for the first time. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the stone path. Eleanor returned to her roses, her heart steady. She didn't need Clara's acknowledgement, she needed her gone. The foreclosure process moved faster now. The bank, armed with Eleanor's evidence, was relentless. Harold's attempts to negotiate failed, his charm useless against the cold reality of numbers. He began to pack, his movements frantic, as if he could outrun the consequences. Eleanor watched, her silence louder than any accusation. She didn't hate him, she pitied him. A man who'd thrown away a lifetime for a fleeting illusion. Eleanor's nights were spent reflecting, not on the past, but on the future. She imagined her grandchildren playing in the garden, her children visiting without the shadow of betrayal. She wanted the house to be a place of love again, not a battleground. She worked tirelessly, ensuring every legal detail was in place, every asset protected. The trust was finalized, her children's inheritance secure. She was building a legacy, not just for herself, but for them. One evening, as she sat in the study, Margaret joined her. "What happens next?" she asked. Eleanor looked at her daughter, seeing the strength she'd passed down. "We rebuild," she said simply. "We always do." Margaret nodded, and for the first time in months, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. The pain was still there, but so was her resolve. The final blow came quietly. A letter from the bank confirmed the foreclosure date. Harold and Clara had 1 month to vacate. Eleanor didn't celebrate, she mourned the life she'd thought she'd have, the man she'd thought Harold was. But she also felt a quiet pride. She'd fought, not with screams or tears, but with the steady hand of a woman who knew her worth. As the days ticked down, Eleanor prepared for the end. She cleaned the house, not for Harold or Clara, but for herself. She polished the kitchen table, tended the garden, hung new curtains in her favorite soft blue. The house was hers again, in spirit if not yet in law. And when the time came, she'd be ready to step into the next chapter, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The final month was a slow unraveling, like a tapestry coming apart thread by thread. Harold and Clara's arguments filled the house, their voices sharp with blame and desperation. Eleanor moved through the chaos with a quiet grace, her presence a stark contrast to their unraveling. She'd won, not through vengeance, but through the steady application of truth. The foreclosure was imminent, and with it, the end of their illusion. Harold tried one last time to salvage things. He cornered Eleanor in the study, his face haggard. "We can fix this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Sell some properties. Refinance something." Eleanor looked at him, the man she'd loved for decades, now a stranger. "You made your choices, Harold," she said softly. "Now live with them." He stared, as if seeing her for the first time, then left without another word. Eleanor felt no satisfaction, only a deep, aching sorrow for what could have been. Clara's departure was less dignified. She packed her bags in a flurry, her designer clothes stuffed haphazardly into suitcases. She didn't speak to Eleanor, didn't acknowledge the woman who'd dismantled her dreams. As she dragged her belongings to the car, Eleanor watched from the window, her hands clasped. She didn't hate Clara, she pitied her. A woman who'd built her life on someone else's foundation, only to watch it collapse. With Clara gone, the house felt lighter, though Harold lingered, his presence a ghost of their past. He moved through the rooms like a man lost, his charm replaced by defeat. Eleanor gave him space, focusing on her own preparations. She met with the lawyer to finalize the transfer of assets, ensuring the house and business would remain in her name. She spoke with her children, who were now fully aware of the situation. Margaret stayed close, offering support, while Thomas planned a visit, his anger softened by pride in his mother's strength. Eleanor's garden became her refuge. She spent hours there, tending the roses, their resilience a mirror of her own. One afternoon, as she pruned a bush, Margaret joined her. "You're keeping this place alive," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor smiled, her hands steady in the soil. "It's kept me alive," she replied. The garden, like her, had weathered storms and bloomed despite them. The foreclosure date loomed, but Eleanor was ready. She'd worked with the bank to ensure her own financial security, using the trust to protect her assets. The house would go to auction, but she had a plan to buy it back, using the funds she'd safeguarded. It was a risk, but one she was willing to take. This house was more than a building, it was her heart, her history, her home. As the final days approached, Eleanor began to reclaim the space. She removed Clara's decorations, restoring the house to its former warmth. She hung photos of her children and grandchildren, polished the furniture she'd chosen with care. The house began to feel like hers again, each act a step toward healing. She didn't erase Harold entirely. His presence was woven into the walls, but she redefined it, making it her own. One evening, Harold came to her, his suitcase in hand. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice hollow. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. "Where will you go?" she asked, not out of concern, but curiosity. He shrugged, his eyes avoiding hers. "Somewhere," he said. "I don't know." For a moment, she saw the man she'd loved, the man who'd made her laugh, who'd dreamed with her. But that man was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. After he left, Eleanor stood in the living room, the silence profound. She walked to the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The house was hers now, in every way that mattered. She felt the weight of her journey, the pain, the betrayal, the quiet victories. But she also felt a spark of hope, a sense that the future was hers to shape. The auction day arrived, and Eleanor was there, her lawyer by her side. The house was sold, but she'd planned for this. Using the funds she'd protected, she placed the winning bid, her heart pounding as the gavel fell. The house was hers again, free of Harold's shadow, free of Clara's intrusion. She walked through the front door, her steps steady, and felt the walls welcome her home. That night, she sat in the garden, the roses glowing under the moonlight. She thought of her children, her grandchildren, the life she'd fought for. She'd lost a husband, but she'd gained something greater herself. Eleanor Grayson was no longer defined by the man who'd betrayed her. She was a woman who'd reclaimed her life, her home, her legacy. And she was ready for whatever came next. The house was quiet now, its rooms filled with the soft hum of a new beginning. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a fresh cup of tea, the scent of lemon cleaner mingling with the roses she'd brought inside. The foreclosure was behind her, the house hers again, not just in name but in spirit. She'd fought for it, not with anger, but with the steady resolve of a woman who knew her worth. The battle had been long, but the victory was hers. Margaret and Thomas visited often, their presence a balm to Eleanor's heart. They brought their children, and the house echoed with laughter again, the kind that had been absent for too long. Eleanor watched her grandchildren play in the garden, their small hands brushing against the roses she'd tended through the storm. "This is your home," she told them, her voice warm. "Always." They didn't understand the weight of her words, but they smiled, and that was enough. The business, too, was recovering. Eleanor had taken full control, her meticulous nature guiding it back to stability. She sold off the risky properties Harold had acquired, focusing on the rentals that had always been the heart of their work. She hired a new manager, a young woman with a sharp mind and a kind heart, someone who reminded Eleanor of her younger self. The business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, a testament to her resilience. The townsfolk's whispers had changed. Where there was once pity, there was now respect. They saw Eleanor at the market, her head high, her silver hair catching the light. They spoke of her strength, her grace, the way she'd reclaimed her life without a single raised voice. Eleanor didn't care for their approval, but she appreciated the shift. It meant the world saw her as she saw herself, not a victim, but a force. She thought of Harold sometimes, wondering where he'd gone. He'd sent a letter once, a rambling apology that she'd read but not answered. She didn't hate him, she loved him too long for that, but she no longer needed him. Clara, too, was a memory. Her name rarely mentioned. Eleanor had no desire to know where she'd gone or what she'd done. They were part of a chapter that was closed. A story she'd rewritten with her own hand. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in the study, she found the photo from their early years, the one of her and Harold in front of their first property. She didn't tuck it away this time. Instead, she placed it on the shelf, a reminder of the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. She'd built that life with Harold, but she'd saved it alone. That was her power, her legacy. Her children noticed the change. "You seem lighter," Margaret said one evening, as they sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor smiled, her eyes soft. "I am," she said. "I've let go of what didn't serve me." Thomas, who'd flown in for the weekend, nodded. "You're a badass, Mom," he said, grinning. Eleanor laughed, a sound that filled the room with warmth. She hadn't heard that word before, but she liked it. The garden remained her sanctuary. She spent her mornings there, tending the roses, planting new ones. Each bloom was a promise, a reminder that life could flourish after even the harshest storms. She invited her grandchildren to help, teaching them the names of the flowers, the way to care for them. "They're strong," she told them, "but they need love." Like her, they thrived with care. As winter approached, Eleanor began to plan. She wanted to travel, to see the places she'd dreamed of in her youth but never visited. She wanted to write, to tell her story not for revenge, but for healing, for others who might need to know they weren't alone. She wanted to live, fully and fiercely, in the time she had left. The house, the business, the garden, they were hers. But they weren't her limits. They were her foundation. One evening, as snow dusted the garden, Eleanor stood at the window, her tea warm in her hands. The house glowed behind her, filled with the light of her life. She thought of the years ahead, the possibilities that awaited. She'd lost a husband, a partner, but she'd gained herself. And that, she knew, was worth more than any dream Harold and Clara had chased. Eleanor Grayson was no longer the quiet wife, the invisible partner. She was a woman who'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger. A woman who'd reclaimed her home, her heart, her legacy. She was free, and she was ready. The future was hers, and she would ride it with the same courage that had carried her through the storm.